Chapter 1. The Ruthless King and His Adopted Heir. King Aurelion Viremont was feared long before he ever wore a crown. At 33, he ruled the continent with an iron will and a blade-sharp mind. An Enigma King, born wrong in the eyes of the world and terrifyingly right in the eyes of fate. Enigmas were rare, unpredictable, and monstrously powerful, and Aurelion had been all of that since childhood. His presence alone bent rooms into silence. His gaze could freeze seasoned generals. His orders had rewritten borders. Cold-eyed, sharp-tongued, ruthless, he had conquered rival lands at 17 and crushed rebellion before 30. Mercy was a myth whispered by fools. Survival was law. And yet, there was one being in the world who could tug at something buried deep inside his ironclad soul. Princess Aurelion Viremont. She was 20 now, graceful, intelligent, and warm in ways Aurelion had never allowed himself to be. The court called her the king's jewel, the kingdom's heart. But she was not his blood, and anyone who dared forget that truth and twist it did not live long. 20 years ago, when Aurelion himself had been 13, the world had already taught him cruelty. He had not gone into the forest that night for sentiment. He had gone because he was hunting. The nobles who acted as his guardians after his parents' deaths had begun plotting, quietly, carefully, whispering about control, about removing the unstable Enigma heir. Aurelion had overheard enough to understand. If he stayed inside palace walls, he would die. So he fled into the northern forest alone. Cold, biting into his skin, snow soaking his boots, blood still wet on his hands from the blade he had stolen. The forest was merciless that night. And then he heard it. A sound too small to belong to a beast. A thin, broken cry, weak, uneven, barely clinging to life. Aurelion followed it with the instincts of a predator, expecting a trap or a dying animal. Instead, he found an infant. She could not have been more than a year old. Wrapped in rags already stiff with frost, her tiny body lay half buried beneath a fallen tree. Her cheeks were pale, her lips trembling, her small fists clenched as if refusing to surrender despite the cold stealing her breath. An Omega child. Abandoned. Alone. Aurelion stopped. That moment, more than any battle, etched itself into his memory. Not because she was crying, but because she did not stop breathing, even as death pressed close. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle her, though she was barely conscious. When his gloved finger brushed her cheek, her tiny hand curled weakly around it. Something inside him fractured. 13-year-old Aurelion, already sharpened by betrayal and blood, removed his cloak and wrapped it around her fragile body, shielding her from the snowstorm howling above them. "You live," he murmured, voice rough and unfamiliar even to himself. "You will live." When he carried her back toward the palace days later, silent, fever warm against his chest, his blade still hidden beneath his coat, the court was thrown into chaos. An Omega infant. No name, no lineage, no explanation. A liability. Aurelion stood before them, eyes cold beyond his years. "She is mine," he declared. "Touch her, question her, or threaten her, and I will kill you." That night, he named her Aurelion, the one who endures. From that moment on, Aurelion Viremont was no longer just an Enigma heir. He was a guardian. Now, 20 years later, Aurelion stood beside him in the great hall, laughing softly as nobles bowed too low and spoke too sweetly. She called him father, not because he demanded it, but because to her he was. Aurelion had taught her how to read strategy maps before fairy tales. He had given her daggers before dolls. He had raised her to be strong in a world that devoured Omega's whole. And for her, he would burn kingdoms. So when the nobles proposed her marriage to Lord Cassian Ardent, an alpha from one of the oldest and most respected noble families, Aurelion agreed. It was logical. Cassian Ardent was honorable, his bloodline ancient, his reputation impeccable. The alliance would stabilize the realm. Purely political, purely necessary. Aurelion told himself that repeatedly as Cassian first entered the court. Tall, calm, unafraid, and utterly uninterested in the king's intimidation. Aurelion noticed. He did not expect to, but he did. And somewhere deep within the ruthless Enigma King, something old, something dangerous, began to stir. Chapter 2. The Alpha Who Was a Problem. Lord Cassian Ardent was, quite simply, a problem. Not a dangerous one. Those Aurelion knew how to handle. Not a political one. Those he crushed before breakfast. Cassian was the far worse kind. An irritating one. He was handsome in a way that felt deliberate, as though he woke every morning and chose to be offensive about it. Calm to the point of provocation, sharp with sarcasm, respectful enough to avoid execution but never ever submissive. And worst of all, he wasn't impressed by King Aurelion Viremont. Most nobles trembled in Aurelion's presence. Cassian merely bowed, straightened, and then had the audacity to meet the king's gaze like he was greeting an equal instead of the most terrifying enigma to ever rule a continent. Aurelion noticed immediately. He disliked it immediately. He kept watching anyway. Cassian treated Princess Elowen kindly. That at least was acceptable. He spoke to her easily, teased her like an old friend, listened when she talked about trade routes and border disputes. He escorted her through the gardens with practiced politeness, offered his arm without expectation, protected her from over-eager nobles. But he never once looked at her like a future mate. No lingering glances, no subtle courting gestures, no alpha possessiveness. Nothing. Elowen noticed. She raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. Aurelion noticed too. His jaw tightened every time Cassian smiled at her without wanting her. At first, the king told himself his attention toward Cassian was suspicion. Why was this alpha so relaxed? Why was he not trying harder? Why was he not afraid? Then suspicion turned into curiosity. Curiosity became irritation when Cassian's visits grew longer. Tea turned into dinner. Dinner turned into late-night debates. Debates turned into laughter echoing through the palace halls. Laughter that, infuriatingly, included Aurelion's own voice. Aurelion had ruled alone for decades. So why did the presence of this alpha feel like an invasion? "You're scowling again," Elowen remarked cheerfully one evening, watching Cassian argue with the minister over trade tariffs. "I am listening," Aurelion replied flatly. Elowen smiled sweetly. "You're glaring." "He's wrong." Cassian glanced over at that exact moment, caught the look, and smiled. Aurelion's eye twitched. Cassian was everywhere. In the council chambers, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. In the training yard, sparring with knights half his size and somehow winning while making jokes. In the library, reading forbidden strategy texts and casually correcting royal scribes. And worst of all, he stayed. "Your guest has remained 3 days longer than protocol allows," the head steward said carefully. "I did not dismiss him," Aurelion replied. "Yes, your majesty." "Why are you still here?" Aurelion finally asked Cassian one night over wine. Cassian smiled lazily. "You haven't told me to leave." The audacity. Their conversations became dangerous. Cassian challenged Aurelion's strategies, mocked his paranoia, teased him for brooding too much. "You do realize," Cassian drawled once, "that glaring at maps won't make them behave." "I conquered half this continent by glaring," Aurelion replied coldly. Cassian laughed. "Then I'll be sure to behave." Aurelion hated that laughter. It did unsettling things to his focus. Elowen, meanwhile, watched everything with sharp omega intuition. "You like him," she said one afternoon. "I do not." "You stare at him." "I assess threats." "He's drinking tea." "He could poison it." Cassian, overhearing, raised his cup. "If I wanted you dead, your majesty, I'd try harder." Elowen snorted. Aurelion did not deny it. Why did this alpha's presence feel like occupation? Why did his absence feel noticeable? And why did the Enigma King feel an unfamiliar, dangerous urge to keep him? Aurelion Viremont did not yet have answers. But somewhere between sarcasm, shared wine, and laughter echoing through stone halls, the problem named Cassian Ardent had already settled far too deep into the heart of his kingdom, and into the king himself. Sorry for interrupting the story for a moment. This story belongs to Anastasia 0_0, its original creator and YouTube channel of the same name. If you found this story anywhere else, please report it immediately. Now, back to our story. Chapter 3. Fate is a cruel jester. Fate did not arrive with thunder or prophecy. It arrived during a council meeting. Aurelion Viremont was seated at the head of the long obsidian table, listening to ministers argue about border taxes. Utterly bored, mildly murderous, perfectly composed, Lord Cassian Ardent stood beside the table. Too close. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was that Cassian shifted his weight, leaned just a fraction nearer, and for the briefest, most catastrophic moment, his scent slipped free. Not fully. Just enough. The world snapped. Aurelion's breath hitched. His vision sharpened. His Enigma instincts roared awake like a beast unchained, slamming into his consciousness with violent certainty. Fated. Mate. His. The realization struck like a blade straight through the ribs. Aurelion Viremont, who had ended wars without flinching, had to grip the armrest of his throne to keep himself steady. Across the table, Cassian calmly continued discussing grain tariffs. The audacity. Cassian Ardent had known from the very beginning. The very first day he stepped into the Viremont Palace, months ago, right after his engagement to Princess Elowen was announced, he had scented it. That impossible pull. That wrong-right certainty. The Enigma King was his fated mate. Cassian had nearly laughed out loud. Of all the cursed jokes fate could play, the king of the continent, his betrothed's father, a terrifying enigma who could execute him with a glance? Absolutely not. Cassian had shut his scent down immediately. Tight, controlled, disciplined like a blade sheathed at the throat. If he let even a hint of it surface back then, the situation would have exploded spectacularly. And worse, Aurelion might have rejected him, because Cassian was supposed to be Elowen's future husband, and Cassian had never once wanted her that way. So instead, he did something far more dangerous. He stayed. He lingered. He made himself unforgettable. Back in the present, Aurelion ended the council meeting abruptly. Enough, he snapped. You're all dismissed. Ministers fled. Cassian raised an eyebrow. Efficient. Aurelion turned on him slowly, eyes glowing faintly, dangerously. You, the king said softly, will stay. Cassian took a sip of wine someone had foolishly left behind. I seem to be doing that a lot. From that day onward, the palace descended into chaos. Aurelion became obsessive, possessive. Cassian was invited to every meal, every council session, every hunt. Guards followed him discreetly. His chambers were moved closer to the king's. Nobles who stared too long were reassigned to distant, unpleasant provinces. One duke complimented Cassian's appearance. He was exiled by sunset. Cassian noticed. Oh, he drawled one evening, lounging beside Aurelion with scandalous comfort, wineglass dangling loosely from his fingers. Am I being courted or imprisoned, Your Majesty? Aurelion smiled. It was the kind of smile that had ended bloodlines. Neither, he said. Yet. Cassian hummed. Reassuring. It was not. Elowen understood everything within a week. She had been raised by Aurelion, after all. Subtlety was not required. She watched the way her father's gaze followed Cassian, the way his patience evaporated when the alpha was gone, the way his presence alone soothed the king's storms. One afternoon she sighed dramatically and said, You should just marry him. Aurelion choked on his tea. Cassian laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. Elowen smiled. And instead of jealousy, she chose love. For her father. She stepped aside with grace that stunned the court. And then, because fate apparently enjoyed excess, months later, Elowen met Queen Seraphina of the northern clans. An alpha ruler. Regal, sharp-tongued, devastatingly elegant. They locked eyes once. Then twice. Then destiny folded in on itself. Elowen fell hard. Seraphina fell harder. They were mates. Cassian congratulated them with wine and sarcasm. Aurelian pretended not to plan an empire-wide wedding. And one night, after months of restraint, after carefully orchestrated curiosity and tension, Cassian finally let his scent slip. Just a little. Just enough. Aurelian went rigid. The bond slammed into place like a crown settling onto his soul. Cassian leaned in, voice low and amused. Took you long enough. The Enigma King stared at him, shaken, undone, and utterly ruined. Fate laughed, and the continent braced itself. Chapter 4: Love, Chaos, and a Menace Alpha. Cassian Ardent did not make things easy. At all. If anything, once the bond was acknowledged and the court stopped pretending the inevitable was not happening, Cassian seemed to take it as a personal challenge to test just how much the Enigma King could endure. He argued with him. Frequently. Loudly. In public. No, Cassian said flatly during a council meeting. That's a terrible idea. The entire chamber froze. Aurelian lifted one brow. Care to explain why? Because it's inefficient, dramatic, and unnecessarily violent. Aurelian considered this. Those are usually my strengths. Cassian smiled sweetly. Exactly. Half the council aged 10 years on the spot. Cassian mocked Aurelian's possessiveness relentlessly. You know, Cassian remarked one morning as guards trailed him through the halls, most kings don't assign escorts to their spouses. They are not escorts, Aurelian replied coolly. They are preventative measures. Against what? You. Cassian laughed and kissed him anyway, which did absolutely nothing to help Aurelian's restraint. You're terrifying, Cassian told him once, lounging across the king's desk like he had every right to be there. And yet, Aurelian replied calmly, signing execution orders without looking up, you stay. I'm an alpha, Cassian smirked. We enjoy danger. Aurelian looked up then, eyes dark, smile slow. So do enigmas. The desk did not survive the conversation. Their courtship, if it could even be called that, was chaos. Bickering in hallways, stolen glances across council tables, public arguments that ended with Cassian storming off and Aurelian following 5 minutes later under the pretense of state business. Private tenderness stolen in shadowed corridors. Aurelian, who had never begged for anything in his life, found himself asking. Cassian, menace that he was, enjoyed every second of it. When Aurelian finally confessed, it was not gentle. It was raw, obsessive, unapologetic. I do not love halfway, Aurelian told him, voice low and dangerous. I do not share. I do not retreat. If you stay completely. Cassian stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. You're insane. Yes? Cassian stepped closer, eyes bright. Oh, I suppose I am too. That was that. Their wedding shook the continent. Ancient banners unfurled. Enigma rites performed. Alpha vows spoken with sharp tongues and sharper promises. Aloin cried openly, smiling so wide it hurt. She also threatened 3 nobles, 1 priest, and a duke who sneezed too loudly during the vows. Ruining this wedding is punishable by death, she informed them cheerfully. Cassian approved. Aurelian pretended not to hear. The continent exhaled. The celebrations had barely ended when Aurelian did something unexpected. He arranged Elowen's marriage. Not as a political transaction, but as a gift. Queen Seraphina of the northern clans arrived in full regalia, radiating alpha authority and quiet devotion. Elowen beamed. The mating bond was undeniable. The wedding was swift, elegant, and filled with laughter. Aurelian watched his daughter walk away on the arm of her mate, and for the first time in decades, felt peace. Cassian squeezed his hand. You did good. Aurelian nodded. I know. When Elowen and Seraphina departed for the northern kingdoms, the farewells were dramatic. Elowen hugged her father fiercely. Don't brood. I do not brood. You brood. Cassian snorted. Seraphina bowed respectfully. She will be cherished. Aurelion met her gaze. She will be protected. Elowen rolled her eyes. I married an alpha queen, father. I'll survive. Then she hugged Cassian. Behave. Cassian grinned. No promises. As the newlyweds returned to their own kingdom, Cassian stretched lazily on the throne beside Aurelion. Well, he said, we've traumatized the court, terrified the nobles, and rearranged the political map. Aurelion glanced at him. And? Cassian smirked. Best marriage I've ever had. Aurelion leaned in, pressing a kiss to his temple. You are impossible. And yet, Cassian replied smugly, you married me. The Enigma King smiled. And the world, finally, stayed quiet. Chapter 5. The heir no one expected. After the marriage, one truth became painfully obvious to the entire palace. King Aurelion Viremont could not leave his husband alone. At all. Meals were shared. Work was relocated. Council sessions were mysteriously shortened. Cassian's chambers became the king's chambers, and anyone who questioned this was reminded, politely and firmly, that Enigma Kings did not explain themselves. Their consummation, while discreet and private, was frequent, excessively so according to the healers. Aurelion, who had once ruled continents without rest, now structured his days around his alpha's presence. Cassian found this hilarious. You do realize, Cassian said one morning, adjusting his robes while Aurelion hovered like a dragon guarding treasure, that if you keep staring, I'll start charging rent. Aurelion merely pressed a kiss to his knuckles. I am already paying. 9 months later, fate laughed again. Cassian stared at the royal healer in disbelief. Pregnant? Yes, your majesty, the healer said calmly, as if announcing mild weather. Very much so. Cassian blinked once, then twice. He looked down at himself. Huh. When Aurelion was told, the reaction shook the palace more than any war declaration ever had. The Enigma King, who had never bowed to gods or men, fell to his knees before Cassian, hands trembling as though holding the fragile edge of the world. My alpha, Aurelion whispered, voice breaking with reverence. Our child. Cassian sighed fondly. If you become more possessive than this, I'm banning you from my side of the bed. Aurelion smiled, soft, dangerous, and hopelessly in love. Pregnancy did not make Cassian gentle. It made him worse. He argued with ministers while seated, threw pillows at Aurelion when annoyed, ordered midnight feast with royal authority and zero shame. Aurelion indulged every whim. Elowen returned to the palace the moment she heard the news. She took one look at Cassian, gasped dramatically, and declared, You're glowing. I hate you. Then she promptly moved into the palace and took over his care. She supervised meals, walks, rest, lectured Aurelion daily. You're hovering, she said. He is carrying my heir. He is also carrying a personality. Let him breathe. Cassian watched them with amusement, eating candied fruit paid for by the treasury. As the months passed, gifts arrived. Too many. From Aurelion, jewel-lined cradles, enchanted blankets, titles already prepared. From Elowen, clothes sewn by the finest artisans, toys from every kingdom, tiny crowns just in case. The baby had 3 nurseries. Cassian threatened to burn one down. Aurelion vetoed that gently. When the child was finally born, the palace held its breath. A son. Dark-haired, sharp-eyed, quiet but watching. They named him Prince Aurelion Viremont Ardent, heir of sky and storm. Aurelion wept openly. Cassian pretended not to notice. Elowen kissed her brother's forehead, smiling with pure joy before finally returning to her own kingdom, confident and at peace. In the quiet weeks that followed, the palace softened. Aurelion learned how to cradle something without breaking it. Cassian learned patience. They spent nights together. No court, no war, just the sound of breathing and a sleeping child between them. The kingdom learned a new truth. The most ruthless Enigma King in history had been utterly, foolishly, irreversibly conquered. By love, by an alpha, by a child. And he had never been happier.